Thank you all for coming to this event. Can you all hear me? My name is Tina Sachs. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare and the chair of the Center for Research on Social Change, which sponsored today's event. And welcome. Today's event is entitled The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies. I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues, the African American Studies Department, and the Native American Studies Program. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with the university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. The format of today's event is that after I introduce her, Professor King is going to talk about her work with us. Then we will have a Q&A facilitated by a few of our graduate students who have joined us today. They are Nicole Ramsey, PhD candidate, African American and African Diaspora Studies; Jane Henderson, PhD student in Geography; Ataya Sespuch, PhD student in Environmental Science, Policy and Management; Ree Botts, PhD candidate in African American and African Diaspora Studies; and Sierra Ed, PhD student in Ethnic Studies. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and the students will ask those questions on your behalf. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Tiffany King, Associate Professor of African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. Her research is situated at the intersections of slavery and Indigenous genocide in the Americas. Her talk today will be primarily drawn from her book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies. Professor King is also co-editor of an anthology titled Otherwise Worlds, Against Settler Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism, which was published just a few months ago. This collection of essays features leading scholars in the fields of Black and Indigenous studies in order to stage a conversation between Black and Indigenous thought and politics on, quote, otherwise, unquote, terms that are less mediated by conquest and settler colonial logics. Please join me in welcoming Professor King.
Thank you so much. Can folks hear me okay? Good. Tina and Deborah, thank you so much for the invitation. I truly appreciate it. Hope to visit the Bay Area under different circumstances. And thank you, Sierra, Nicole, Jane, Ree, Ataya, right? And also Max, who I briefly talked to for helping to put on this event and just holding space. I appreciate it. I'm gonna share my screen now. I have some slides to show folks. Are folks able to see a PowerPoint presentation? Great. And I'll make sure to speak up. It was wonderful to be here for the land acknowledgement. Thank you for that, Tina. And we'll hear at least two today because I'm gonna start with a land acknowledgement as well. And the way I typically start a discussion of my book is by talking about the group Red, Bike, and Green. And in 2016, I attended one of their bike tours, and they actually put on what they called a 2-mile dialogical bike tour, this place, to actually take the opportunity to remap the increasingly gentrifying space of Atlanta. And so this group of Black bikers are primarily Black, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming activists and organizers in the city. So they organize with groups like Southerners Underground, Sister Song, SNAPCO, and are folks who have been on the ground even before 2016 and have been a part of organizing and strategizing the current rebellion. So this particular day, they invited people to a few stops around the city. And one of those where I was invited to hold space and speak was at a MARTA station, which is the MLK station. And I have the first stop circled on the PowerPoint. And they wanted to acknowledge both the forced labor of enslaved Africans in creating the railroad there, which is now a part of a MARTA stop, and the removal of the Muskogee Cree in the Removal Act of 1830, or what we know as the Trail of Tears. And I start here because I want to affirm in my book that I trust Black people and I trust Black studies as a fitting space to engage a conversation with Native studies about Indigenous genocide, about settler colonialism, and about how that shapes and constitutes slavery, the experience of enslavement in this hemisphere. And so my book explicitly is using the vantage point of Black studies to stage a conversation or a gathering place between the two fields. And so theoretical frames that I rely on in this book are Black feminist studies and Native studies. And provisionally, I'm calling them flesh. In the first chapter, I think about the fleshy analytics of both of those feminist traditions, primarily in Black feminist studies through the work of Jackie Alexander, Sadia Hartman, Sylvia Winter, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Catherine McKittrick, and Taya Miles. And I use as both artists and theorists the work of Julie Dash and Tia Miles's A Cherokee Rose. Her work as a novelist, a creative writer. Charmaine Lurch, who is a Jamaican-Canadian sculptor and multidisciplinary artist, and of course, Audre Lorde's work. And I put them in conversation with Native feminists like Hunani K. Trask and Joanne Barker, Jody Bird, Eve Tuck, Daniel Heath Justice, Coley Driscoll, and then the primary artist slash theorists that I use are Leslie Marmon Silko and Billy Ray Belcour's work. And not to forget, I'm sorry, the way that my slides are situated, I've hidden Mashona Goldman's important work as a Native feminist geographer, and of course, Hortense Spiller's, that Spillerian notion of flesh that ties these two analytics together. And now that I've had some opportunity to sit with the book a year out from its publication, I know that my next project will be to really think the traditions of Black feminist and Native feminist fleshiness a little bit more critically. So I'm going to home in more specifically on the relationship between Black feminist and Native and Indigenous feminist thinkers for a follow-up project. You always need that project to fit in the things that you weren't able to fit in the first book that your editor said, oh, you don't have time. So I'm gonna take that up more robustly in the second project. And the primary sources that I use are sites of protest. I use literature, specifically novels and poetics, maps, film, and sculpture, which I'm going to show you later. Sorry for that little beep. So the organizing metaphor, the shoal, which is something that I came to probably more than half of the way into the project. I was looking for an organizing metaphor and a geographic site that could help me undo the bounded ways that we tend to over-determine and reduce Blackness to the oceanic or liquid, and the ways that we tend to reduce indigeneity to terra or land. So I was looking for like an in-between space, and I was working with the shoreline or the littoral initially, but it wasn't satisfying me because I kept coming back to the problem that shorelines are often incorporated into nation states, right? And I wanted to get away from geographies and territories that get bound up in nationness, right? And become a part of these kind of singular exclusionary claims. So I was actually driving home from work one day, and I drive down a road called Black Shoals every day almost. But in this space, you know, where you tend to have really productive creative moments when you're not actively working on your scholarship. So when you're in the shower doing the dishes, so I'm driving and I finally pay attention to the word shoal. And I'm like, I've never thought about what a shoal is. And so I actually went home and looked it up and I was like, aha, this is what I'm looking for, right? This is what I'm looking for, this kind of sneaky space where the ocean floor pops up and like kind of punches through or kisses the very surface of the ocean. So where water and land meet each other. But the beautiful thing about shoals is that shoals shift over time, right? So you can't always map them. They're hard to define. So I'm like, this is the kind of meeting place that I'm looking for, right? So I'm looking for an actual geographic site that kind of evokes where different ecological systems and specifically indigeneity and Blackness touch one another. Again, wanting to break the like, just the Blackness always being attached to the sea, indigeneity always being attached to the ocean, and creating a new space of becoming where something new happens. And then I also, since I was working so closely with Winter and McKittrick, I really wanted to think about how this metaphor might be in conversation with Winter's notion of the demonic, well, the notion from physics that Winter takes up and that Catherine McKittrick riffs on. And then analytically, I also wanted to make an intervention into settler colonial studies and what I saw as a kind of crowding out of Blackness. It's hard to locate Blackness within white settler colonial studies, I find. It's hard to not think of Blackness as just labor or perhaps even settler in that framework, and I just wasn't satisfied with it. So I wanted to slow the momentum of that, particularly in the period when I was writing my dissertation, 2010, 2011, and wanted to push back against the ways it was taking up space in the academy. And then it was just a great kind of metaphor to help me think about bringing different things together and rubbing them together and seeing what we found, right? So playing with those particular frictions. So I could create some new text and hybrid text in my work. So I have 5 substantive chapters and an introduction. And the first chapter is refreshingly still relevant right now. I'm gonna show a clip about an update of the statue. So in this first chapter, I talk about the various moments where Indigenous activists, for instance, in 2006, beheaded the statue on the eve of a Columbus Day celebration. This particular image, or both of these images, are from 2015 when allegedly Black Lives Matter activists tagged and defaced the statue. And then in 2020, I'm going to show you a clip of this. The statue was beheaded again. I feel like there's a commercial too that we might have to sit through. I'm sorry about that.
Beheaded overnight. It comes amid a nationwide movement to take down statues that celebrate historic figures. Local Indigenous groups are calling for that Columbus statue to stay down. As WBZ's Nick Emmons reports, the city is trying to decide what to do next.
For now, the Christopher Columbus statue is still standing, but the city does plan to take it down at some point for repairs. But Indigenous groups are calling on the mayor to never bring it back. It's being called a slice of symbolic justice.
It's a park dedicated to white supremacy. It's a park dedicated to Indigenous genocide.
A statue of Christopher Columbus decapitated overnight. Now, as police investigate how it happened, local Indigenous groups are calling on the mayor to remove the statue for good.
We've been asking for years that this statue come down and that Columbus no longer be celebrated.
Boston Mayor Marty Walsh says the statue will be put in storage for repairs, and the city will have conversations about what to do next.
And given the conversations that we're certainly having right now in our city of Boston and throughout the country, we're also going to take time to assess the historic meaning of the statue.
Columbus was one of the first Europeans in the New World, but critics say he was violent toward Native Americans who see him as a racist.
The messaging is clear with the statue here that this is an area where white people are welcome, but where our people are not welcome.
Some in the community, though, are strongly against removing the statue.
Christopher Columbus.
And this man interrupted today's news conference repeatedly, at times going face-to-face with people in the crowd who support the removal of the statue. Another man believes damaging the statue or removing it will not erase history.
If somebody had hatred in the beginning, and then you return that hatred with a vigilance of force or malicious destruction, then you are no better than the past. You're actually keeping the past alive.
Anyone?
So let me flip back to the statue. I wanted to start my book with this chapter to think about some figures and start with a very clear figure that both Black people and Indigenous people have historically attacked or attached violence to, right? So this figure of Columbus was both a conquistador and an enslaver, right? And so additionally, I find that within Black studies and Native studies, there is this really robust tradition of interrogating the formation of man or the human, and particularly the way that man is invented through and becomes possible through making Indigenous life and Black life a space of death, right? So this violent kind of humanism is something that I find both fields challenging. And I also wanted to create a discussion about where Native studies and Black studies share a language, where we might code switch with one another. And I thought that conquest was that lingua franca that shared between the fields, right? And particularly going back to a 15th century conquest, where we can think about Columbus both off the shores of what is modern day Senegal and also in this place that we now call the Americas, right? So both Black studies and Native studies has a relationship to this figure and is contesting what this figure means. In my second chapter, I look at an 18th century map, and I do two readings of de Brom's map. So on one level, the map certainly is telling a story of conquest. So it's certainly mapping out who's man. So for instance, in the map that has color, there is there's a cartouche on the corner, the bottom corner, which is a colored kind of illustration of indigo processing. And then there's a legend in the center with a list of the name of the proprietors. And I'm arguing that de Brom creates a map to create humanness in a logocentric version. The true humans are the people who are the property owners who are listed and have language are listed in that legend, right? So the folks who are working on the cartouche, which you can see a zoomed in image of in black and white, are actually fungible figures that become synonymous with the movement of the ocean, the rapid exchange of commodities, the fecundity and growth of this emerging British colony. And then there's a displacement of Indigenous people. Indigenous people on this map represent no space. You can't see it here, but in, for instance, the top left-hand corner of the map, which is the northwest quadrant, if you move from the ocean to the interior, so moving east to west, and in the top hand or left side quadrant, there's actually an arrow that says route away from the Cherokee, right? But there are no symbols of Cherokee settlement or placemaking or cosmologies. There's just an arrow moving away from that space of danger. So in this particular iteration or this reading, this is an attempt at conquest, at making man through the erasure of Indigenous people, through the fungible use of Black bodies. But then I also read this map in a second vein as a very anxious map, right? A map that was actually created in the wake of the Stono Rebellion and after a series of Cherokee insurrections against white settlers, right? So there is continual work that has to happen, particularly on a military scale. De Brom himself was a military surveyor and helped white militia create fortresses and forts and what we would know now as prisons to hold the Cherokee and also police enslaved people who were in states of insurrection. So we know in the Stono Rebellion, several white settlers were killed. And so this map is also an anxious attempt to try and control Black and Indigenous rebellion, which is always happening. And so I continue a reading of this map, specifically the cartouche and the scene of indigo processing, alongside of a reading of Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust, which is theatrically released in 1991. And so there's so much to pay attention to in that beautiful film. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of it. And one of the things that caught my attention on I'd seen the film starting in the late 90s, but in 2010, working on my dissertation and paying attention to Indigenous removal and the use of Black bodies, I wanted to think about how to use the plantation as a place to surface both indigeneity, which often gets effaced under the rubric of labor, and Blackness at the same time. So I was like, in order for me to allow indigeneity to appear on a scene that is overwritten by labor, maybe I need to challenge the rubric of labor. And so this is where I argue that fungibility, particularly as theorized by Saidiya Hartman, is a better frame for thinking about Blackness and its relationship to landscapes, land, particularly indigo, right? Where you actually see indigo moving beyond the cells and like moving through the pores of Black people. And in this kind of exchange that breaks the boundaries between what we would call nature, plants, and indigo plant and human skin, right? So there's something about tracking systems and chemical systems that allows the landscape to open up and for you to think about processes. So if you're thinking about the landscape and bodies as processes, you also have to think about the removal of Indigenous people, right? So what did it take to put the landscape in flux, right? So I was thinking in this chapter, fungibility is a more open and dynamic frame than labor is. Now I'm gonna have to explain that more clearly and convincingly, particularly for a lot of Marxian scholars who have challenged me when I've been doing this book tour. I was really influenced by the work of Shona Jackson in particular, who in Creole Indigeneity is really challenging labor as an onto-epistemology, which I find so fascinating. And I'm so excited for her new work, where she's going to continue this thread of thought. But I didn't take on Marx explicitly in this chapter, and didn't necessarily intend to and didn't want to, but I'm going to return to Marx because I just want to be in conversation and actually have this conversation with people who are Marxist scholars and take the labor theory of value seriously. And in the next project, I do want to think some more with Denise De Silva's work on the labor theory of value, and also Shona Jackson, as well as Leanne Simpson, to really think about the way that Marx lays out in that 1844 economic and philosophic manuscript, what alienated labor is and what ideal labor is. And I think there's still a kind of humanist impulse, even within the ideal notion of work, that I want to continue to think about with Black feminists and Indigenous feminists. And then chapter 4 is a collection really of 2 erotic tales, one by Julie Dash. So her telling of the love story between Iona Pezant and St. Julian Lashchild, and another story by, of course, Taya Miles in A Cherokee Rose, portrays the story between Ruth Mays and Jennifer or Jinx Miko. And I wanted to think about the ways that Black folks like the poet Audre Lorde and the Cree poet Billy Ray Belcour use the erotic, and for Billy Ray Belcour, both the erotic and sexuality, to undo this notion of a bounded sovereign self. So Billy Ray Belcour has a beautiful and compelling critique for me of the political speak of sovereignty. And he does that through thinking about Indigenous erotics. And so I use the erotics to rethink some investments in sovereignty for Native studies and investments in a particular kind of nationness and Black legibility within Black studies and Black politics. And then in my final substantive chapter, I had the opportunity to work with not just the multidisciplinary artist Charmaine Lurch, but she is a scholar who takes up Winter's work through aesthetics. So she has a series of paintings, of sculpture that are directly engaging Sylvia Winter's work. And she was engaging to some extent in this sculpture. It's actually Sycorax, revisiting Sycorax, the notion of the tesseract as a point, right? And a line that can be extended in multiple and confounding directions to actually put into form Indigenous femininity and Black femininity in the figure of Shakespeare's Sycorax. And it's a counterpoint to the first chapter and the image of Columbus, right? This hard cenotaph that is bounded, right, and produced through violence. And it juxtaposes that particular monument, right, and monumentalization of a violent kind of conquistador humanism with an open and relational being that is in the making, right? So Sycorax comes into being through having Black femininity and Indigenous femininity in relationship and in motion with one another, right? So deeply entangled to come into being. And then here is an image of Charmaine actually wiring and working on Sycorax. And to go back to the beginning. So the cover art comes from a series of sketches that Charmaine Lurch was working on. And the story, it makes me cringe because I found out in 2015 that Charmaine was reading my dissertation. And I was like, I can't believe that document is circulating with all of its mistakes and the ugliness that I wanted to hide. But at the time, she was using it to develop a 2-woman performance with her creative partner, Mosa Neely. And they were using some indigo to mark their bodies, and they were doing ceremony. And these were the initial sketches that she was making as Mosa Neely was dancing. And I was like, this figure in motion and its multiplicity is just ideal for the cover. And it's called a Sycorax gesture. So I don't know how much time I have used, but I'm gonna pause there and I'm gonna let will engage me, but thank you.
Tina, do you want to?
Sure. So there are a couple of questions here from the audience. Are students going to be reading the questions?
Yes. Yeah, just didn't know. You get the first chance if you want.
I just have sort of a frame, just a little bit more about the origin of your work, and just curious about how you came to this work. It's incredibly interesting, particularly the way in which you are bringing two bodies of knowledge together. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about your origin story there.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I am someone who grew up on the East Coast in the US. So I was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and lived in the cities of Delaware, Philly, and briefly in Central Virginia. And as an organizer in Philly, I never, ever deployed the language of settler colonialism, particularly working with communities in Philly that were primarily Black and Latinx, like specifically Afro-Boricua communities. Like that was kind of my frame for racial justice, and rarely even thought about Indigenous sovereignty until I actually moved to Toronto for a 2-year program at OISE. And literally the day that I was there, Six Nations had a mobilization, probably on Bloor, and they were in a standoff with settlers at Caledonia. And I had to shift my frame for even thinking about racial violence. And there's not as rigid of a kind of Black-white binary in Toronto around nativeness and settlerness, but that is the primary like axes on which like political discussions around racial violence happen. So I had to reorient myself, and I had the opportunity to actually work with an insight, be a part of an insight chapter in Toronto, which was Black and Indigenous women. And so that really informed all of my scholarly work. So that was 2006. And so then when I came back to the States, that political experience informed the work that I did for my PhD program. And so as a scholar working on a dissertation, I did enter this conversation from the field of settler colonial studies and did try to put Blackness at the center of it, and that still just didn't work. It wasn't sufficient. And I just felt, no, Black studies has something to say about this, but it happens with a different language, with very different concerns and questions. And I wanted to take the field of Black studies seriously and engage Native studies from that point.
Thank you. So with that, if there are several questions here, so I'm wondering if the students would like to field them.
Yes, I'll go first. So thank you, Tiffany, for this wonderful presentation and the contributions to both fields. So I had a question in thinking about Afro-indigenous groups and other groups at the intersections of Blackness and indigeneity, and how indigeneity has often been displaced from Black people. Do you see any connection or maybe present examples to how your work or the shoal speaks to other sites in the Black diaspora?
No, thank you for that question. That has been my next task. Like I couldn't take that on in the way that I wanted to, but that experience, that very lived experience that is being theorized beautifully by folks. I know that there is a session coming up on Afro-Indigenous identity that I have to catch. That's the beauty of Zoom and just the perils of it too. There's so much to do. But that is something that I didn't have the room to take up. And that particular place is going to speak to this shoalness or this space of becoming in ways that are going to blow my mind, and I'm ready for it, right? I really have to immerse myself in that literature and the geographies of it too. Like if I think about New Orleans and Mardi Gras Indians, Romelda Cody, and particularly like exploring Afro-indigenous femininity, which I want to begin to think about in my next project. That's a space that will really open this up. Also thinking with Joy Enomoto's work, who is Black and Indigenous from the Pacific, who is an amazing installation artist, who does beautiful things with critical cartography, not critical geography, critical cartographies, and Blackness and indigeneity in the Pacific is just, I'm excited about what folks are working on. But I am reading TJ Talley's book, Queering Natal, which is looking at, it's doing a queer critique and it's a queer critique and a critical Indigenous studies examination of gender and sexuality and race in a comparative sense in Natal, or what we now know as South Africa. And so TJ Talley's exploration of indigeneity in that region is really important. And the ways, particularly that settlers and the British Empire would compare, particularly Nguni folks or folks who we would know as Zulu, to not necessarily even enslaved Black people in the 19th century, but Native Americans in the US. Like that was the point of comparison on measuring like how primitive they were, right? So there is a way that that Black African body becomes available for indigeneity in ways that West Africa might not, right? And certain kinds of Black indigeneities in this hemisphere in the Americas. So that's interesting work that I need to think with as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor King, for talking us through sort of the outline of your book. And I think there's there's a mix of people on the Q&A who have had a chance to engage your work and also might need like a little bit more explanation for certain things. So one of the questions that came up in the Q&A chat is particularly around Afro-pessimism and your engagement with both Wilderson and Sexton and how they're thinking about the ontological nature of Blackness and indigeneity. And so I think there's a few people, specifically Jennifer Tamayo and Elizabeth Brown, who had questions regarding Afro-pessimism. And maybe you could also take this opportunity to talk a bit about your book, the edited volume, Otherwise Worlds, because I know you have an interview with Frank Wilderson in that edited volume, which I myself found really informative, specifically around this question of Afro-pessimism in relationship to settler colonial studies.
No, thank you for that question. I'll start actually with my dissertation project. I don't think my dissertation project and now book project would have even been possible without Frank Wilderson's Red, White, and Black. And I want to be clear that Wilderson has made a shift in his thinking and conceptualization and theorization of what he calls the savage or the red or native position, right? There has been a shift. And I'm more wedded to what he presented to us in 2010 in Red, White, and Black. I found that critically important for even being able to think the possibility of affinities between Blackness and indigeneity. And I'm gonna come just short of calling them coalition, because I think we need some other language other than coalition. But my stuff does orbit around and come into proximity with coalition politics between Black and Indigenous people. But his formulation of indigeneity is not fully occupying humanness, but being able to perhaps invoke it through a discourse of sovereignty, I found really compelling. And it guided a good deal of the analysis in my work. And so Frank does start to shift, and we had a conversation about that in the Otherwise World interview that I did with him. And he was finding what Jared Sexton was arguing about sovereignty, Indigenous relationships to land, to nation, as things that presented foreclosures for Black folks, right? There are things that Black people could not access. And so if we were actually thinking about a particular kind of freedom for Black folks in the rest of the world, we would really have to think through abolition, where those categories were divested from, perhaps. And so his understanding of, or Wilderson's understanding of, you know, the Native as kind of not sharing the same position as people of color or white folks in civil society did shift, right? And so there is a shift from this kind of tripartite triad to a Black and the rest of the world shift that I am not on board with at this point in my political or scholarly development right now. So Frank has left me behind, and I'm still with Frank in 2010. But I do understand the arguments. I do understand theoretically what Sexton and Wilderson are both thinking through and working through. I am not politically, and I feel like I want to use the word ethically, it doesn't feel right for me to position indigeneity in the same place as humanness and whiteness. It feels a little clunky and not all the way, it don't curl over for me fully, if I can put it like that. So I hope that answered the question. I didn't read it, but if it didn't sufficiently, folks can ask it again.
Thanks so much, Professor King, for your work and your talk today. I just feel really grateful to be here. But I had a question. Reading your book, I love your intervention of the conquistador as, you know, this figure that's kind of uniting anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, or just doing different work. But I also, you know, I sense this tension, and I saw on your slide, like the incompleteness of conquest. And so I'm wondering if you can talk more about like how using this term of the conquistador, like how can we bring in the like incompleteness, or, you know, I think the ways that both Black folks and Indigenous folks are continually asserting that we are not conquered people.
No, thank you for that. And I thank you for bringing up the way that conquest like sits with the reader, right? I think I wanted to do something to displace the weight of settlement for a couple of reasons, just because of literally the space that it was taking up in the social sciences and the humanities, particularly American studies spaces, the white oceanic feel of it, the masculinist feel of it, and some of it's like anti-Black currents within it, right? So I was like, I need another kind of term, but I also don't want to dismiss the kind of work that folks like Hunani K. Trask did to like actually make it discursively available, right? And so not say that it's not useful, but there was something about settler and settlement that didn't have the force, and it didn't directly like deal with the gratuitous violence. Like that's one of the reasons why I really appreciated Frank's work, like the kind of eliminations of worlds, like the elimination of Indigenous world making, of Black world making that the gratuitous violence of the US and other settler states produces is something that exceeds the language and discourse of settlement. Like it just, I needed something else. And so there was something about the unflinching bloodiness of like 15th, 16th century conquistador violence that I was like, that is just more on the nose for me than settlement is. Not that we should settle with this or concede that the project is done, but I was trying to find a place where Indigenous people invoked unflinchingly and full-throatedly the violence of genocide, and Black people could also invoke like the violence of social and physical death. And there's a way that settlement blunted that. So that's why I leaned in to conquest, not to say that it was a total project, right? And that's one of the reasons for that second chapter, is to talk about even conquest as a nervous and incomplete project, because white people were always also on the run from Black insurrection and Indigenous insurrection, right? They were always having to adjust, and they were nervous and retreating. And so they're very nervous, unstable kinds of figures too. So it wasn't to, using conquest wasn't to invoke a kind of total violence, but it was a shift away from settler and settlement, which is a little too passive for me. I mean, what happens with settlement is much more violent and crass and produces carnage in a way that settlement doesn't evoke or invoke for me. So that's a little bit about my decision to use it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi again, I'm Ree, doctoral candidate in African Diaspora Studies. I really appreciate your work. I'm from Atlanta and Philly, so I'm very familiar with Black Shoals. My father lives right off of Black Shoals, so I really appreciated the way that you broke that down and really had a lot of relation to that landscape that you were conjuring, so I appreciate that. I'm really interested in how you open up with thinking about what read to me like the weight of the knowledge, right? The weight of the grief that you were witnessing in solidarity with folks who you had come to know and love. And I'm just really interested if you could speak more to what that grief and healing looks like. You talk about wanting to work toward wellness. You talk about this haunting. I'm just wondering personally, how does that live on you and in your body, in your own embodied sense of knowing, in your relation to writing this work and putting it out, and then being on the second phase, right, doing this work so wholeheartedly. Just wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I had an experience like I've never experienced in my life in Toronto. Just first being on different ground that holds a different kind of historical violence is a very visceral and embodied experience. Like I am well aware now that I know my body knows how to navigate like the psychic energy of the US South, right? There are ways that I can kind of feel the presence of ancestors a little bit more thickly in port cities like Charleston or New Orleans. I can still feel it here in Atlanta, which I've known this, but I just came to terms with the fact that both of my parents' ancestors were enslaved in Georgia. So my mother's people in Camilla, my father's people in Savannah. And so I think my body has trained itself to be okay amidst this kind of violence. But then moving to a different territory, a space of occupation where Indigenous people can narrate literally being tracked by death, and you sit with that and witness that, and they tell you how to feel that when they take you through the land, it has an impact on the body, and I wasn't ready to process it. So I carried that. I have multiple health issues that I'm still working out. I had the wonderful fortune of being in Toronto when Jackie Alexander was there. And she's like, great, you have a project that has brought you to your knees. Now you got to work it out. That's what you have to do in the academy, right? I mean, that is the one thing that you can do in the academy. You can assure that you're going to be able to have a job here, that you're going to be able to make a life here, but you can work out some of the things that are going on with your body and your psyche and your emotional space and your spirit. So take the opportunity to do it. So this project is very much a part of my healing process, and just the disorientation, and just, I had a knowledge about genocide that was beyond the theoretical, and I needed it, right? And I needed it, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you.
And I had folks, Christine Luza and Zainab Amadahi as Anishinaabe and Black Cherokee folks to like hold me and help me process that violence too, as Indigenous women. So I had good community, yeah, to carry, and were definitely my doulas for this. So
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, yeah, thank you again. And hi everyone, my name's Sierra. I just to circle back to some of the Q&A questions, some of them wanted to, or were related to the idea of Black indigeneity and sort of like how theorizing through that also interacts with like the actual subjectivity and like lived identity of some folks. And if you could speak a little bit about like how people who identify as Black Indigenous folks like speak a similar language in terms of like resistance and with like Indigenous and Native peoples as well. And also in writing and working on this book, what were there any moments of like transformative like discovery for you in addition to like what you've already sort of elaborated on?
Oh, I almost didn't unmute myself. No, thank you. And I love that the question keeps coming up, because it reminds me of the work that I want to do and I have to do and I have yet to do. And it helps me think about my investments. Okay, so on one level, I am not someone who can claim indigeneity. I don't know that to be true. I rarely have heard Black people invoke that. Well, all of my immediately family members are Black, invoke indigeneity. I maybe have had one family member talk about their indigenousness, but there was no basis for that. And then I also, probably when I heard that, experienced it as a kind of anti-Blackness because of who they were. So I was someone who never took the time to think about any kind of blood relationship to indigeneity. And again, I spoke a little bit about my political orientation, did not organize directly with Indigenous communities or have those relationships. So have not spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be Black and Indigenous in the world. But one thing that I would love to attune myself to, particularly when this person brought up language, that there is a distinct language of Afro-indigeneity. I have been struggling with what I articulated as an impasse between the fields. Like, I think before I started reading seriously the work of folks doing Black ecologies, like I was really struggling with what I felt was not a deficiency within Black studies, but we don't use the same language when it comes to land as Indigenous scholars do and Indigenous people do, right? We don't, that is not a space where there's a lot of linguistic overlap, right? And I think that is specifically because of the ways that Black folks have been alienated from land, living in a city that is increasingly gentrifying, the violent ties we've had to land, that our vernacular around land is very different and it's not the same. And even the fact that we don't even get our language system from our location is a very, very, very different kind of point of departure for even coming to land. But I had a brilliant colleague push back, Circes Mendez, who was like, what you're seeing as a lack of vocabulary or vernacular might be because you're looking at the level of language instead of embodiment. So she was talking about people who are in ceremony, particularly in Santeria communities, where there is a dance for Yemenya, right? Or there'll be a dance associated with a particular location and people in ceremony. And she's like, that's where the language may be. So looking at Afro-indigeneity beyond language, right? But also like embodiment and ceremony work is something that I'm really interested in doing, to really delve deeper into like the creation of a shared language. I think that that is a space of intense beauty and also like a shift in skill set. Like I'm gonna have to pay attention to my own body, right? And how bodies do invoke land and water. And I don't know which specific Afro-Indigenous communities I'm gonna look to, but I might start with Joy Enomoto in the Pacific. But no, that's a beautiful question. It's helping me think about what I need to do.
Thank you, Dr. King. We have one question from the audience by Pilar Jefferson, which I'm also interested in terms of methods and how you go about the research process. So Pilar says, thank you so much, Dr. King. I'm curious if there were libraries and/or archives you worked in that were especially helpful for looking at the histories of Black and Indigenous people together.
Okay, Pilar, thank you for this question on research, because it helps me go back to the portion of the question I didn't answer before about surprising things. There were no archives per se where I could either talk to like the special collections person or even type in a database, Black and Indigenous, and like have primary sources pop up for me. So like, for instance, Julie Dash's film is something I returned to. It was something I had a relationship with in the late 90s, but then when it was assigned as a text in Psyche Williams-Forson's class, I could look at it differently since I had been reading the work of Indigenous feminists and settler colonialism. I just had a different eye towards it, right? So it was a primary source that a movie that I was familiar with that I turned into a primary source as a graduate student. And then realized that I hadn't read the novel. So then I read the novel as a graduate student. And I didn't actually, to get to the surprise, I didn't get to de Brom's map until I was deep in the writing phases and went to Eliza Lucas Pinckney's letter book, because I write on that particular white settler in my dissertation, and saw the cartouche and filed it away. I was like, I'm gonna need this. I don't have time to deal with it, but I'm gonna have to come back to it. So probably in 2013, 2014, I started to deal with the map seriously. So I started reading a lot critical cartography studies. I started reading about GIS systems. I started reading on how to read maps. And I was accessing the de Brom map through the Library of Congress. And I wanted to get a better sense of the scale. And I realized that they had a copy of the map in scale at Davidson, which was probably about a 5-hour ride from Atlanta. So I went to Davidson's Special Collections, and not only was it helpful so I could get a sense of the scale of it, because it is a very large map, but also there were just unique features that were literally reproduced because of how the map was preserved, literally how it was folded, the number of times it was folded, what the foldings did to press certain sections of them together, and like the reproductions it created of those Black figures from the cartouche that you would never ever encounter on a digitized map. So there's something also about working in analog and visiting collections and dealing with paper, like taking the kinds of materiality of your primary sources seriously and looking at them from multiple vantage points and in multiple forms, if you have the time, again, right? I was only able to do this as an assistant professor who had like a $2,000 research budget, which is not a lot at all. You deserve more. But again, if you have the time to spend a lot of time with your primary sources and really contextualize them deeply and from multiple places, it opens up things methodologically and theoretically that you can't anticipate. So that's one of the things I can say about surprises. Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna try and maybe combine a few questions that I've seen with some of my own. So we'll just try and get through this. I really appreciate sort of like the core problem that you identify between Blackness and indigeneity, which is rooted in the types of geographies that each sort of identity or category has access to. So like land and water, or sort of a rootedness and maybe like a liquidity, I think was the word that you use in the book. And so there was a couple of people who had questions here about the concepts of like liminality and in-betweenness, as well as the word that you use, errant, to describe geography, grammars, errant grammars. Let me just double check about this question. Grammar as an errant grammar to help you understand sort of perhaps the deviant and or illegible types of connections between Black and Native studies. So I was wondering if maybe you could touch on this idea of errant, perhaps like an in-betweenness or like a fluidity that is often associated with Blackness, but how you're using them together in the Black Shoals to describe like the potential meeting places of Blackness and indigeneity, and to that destabilize basically Blackness from always being a rootless identity or formation. I don't know if that totally made sense. So, I've been out of this academic game for a while with everything going on. So I can repeat parts of it too.
No, I think I get the essence of the question.
Yeah, the essence is around like this, this rootlessness and kind of mobility that characterizes so much of Blackness.
Yeah, I think what, no, you identified it, like it is like overcoming these like particular geographic metaphors of landedness or rootedness and rootlessness, and probably the oceanic or the water or Atlantic, or I'll stay with the ocean because I think Blackness is more than liquidity. I'm particularly thinking about things I was realizing about the ocean when I came across the shoal, right? Like the ocean is not just a space of like unending mystery and mercury and depth. There are like disruptions to that notion of just being able to fluidly move across water. Like literally boats were obliterated, like ships crashed and people died because they would run up against like a limestone like a shoal, right? An obtrusion like in the water that they couldn't see, right? So this idea of the ocean being this flat territory that you could just possess. I wanted to get away from that notion of that kind of, I wanted to play with the notion of the kind of open, fungible availability that discoverers or a colonial mind might imagine about the ocean, and talk about some of the problems that the ocean presents for people navigating it. And it was really helpful to think with, again, Sylvia Wynter's notion of the demonic, like not being able to put your finger on and categorize and name and map and measure, right? So the ocean presents that kind of problem. And I think someone who does that really well right now is Alexis Pauline Goombs with Dub, and all of the things that you have to think about and that you don't think about and that are unthought about the ocean and the relations and are connected to ocean life and its myriad manifestations. So I wanted to make some of those categories less familiar. And so I thought that there was a way that this shoal would defamiliarize both land and the ocean, right? Because the shoal is that meeting point, but it's also shifty. So that's where like the errancy comes in, right? You can't necessarily discipline it. You don't know where it's gonna appear. So you can't predict in advance on what terms Native people and Black people will be able to speak the same language, come together, agree politically. So it's something you have to constantly be open to discovering. And also if that place of negotiation or agreement emerges, it might not always be there. That was true for instance, when I had to reflect on my relationship to insight. Like we were strong as Black and Indigenous women for a couple of years, and then there were some issues where we reached an impasse and we couldn't get it together. So our formation, or maybe that shoal, dissolved, right? And so I wanted to, as best as I could, kind of capture these emerging and spaces of becoming, but also they might dissolve, right? And so the space of becoming of the shoal of both water and land is a space of possibility and a kind of reconfiguration of Blackness and indigeneity on new terms, right? So that's where it kind of gets to the liminality. It's something that you might not fully recognize, right? Once the thing comes together. It's a more ambiguous space that you have to be in relationship to and not so quick to name, right? So those are why I was kind of working with those terms and what I was trying to think about with oceanic and with terra and what would mean for them to come together as ecological systems. Like how would they stretch our imagination?
Yes, thank you. That's exactly, I think, what I was looking for. Appreciate it.
Okay, I'm gonna read a question from the audience, and I'm not gonna combine these two, but I think it also hits on someone else's question that's around a similar theme, and thinking with terms. So someone says, you've mentioned conquest as a kind of lingua franca, a language shared between Black and Indigenous studies. In addition to conquest, are there other terms you're thinking through as code switching between the fields of study?
I mean, just this morning, I was thinking with another scholar about the current phase of rebellion that we're in and rehistoricizing the police. And I'm definitely thinking that Black studies and Native studies gives us frames to think about what are the conditions of possibility that give us the police and who do the police emerge from? And we ended up talking about, again, like people felling and destroying monuments like Columbus, but also being able to see on the streets, Black and Indigenous folks arguing that the police need to be abolished, right? Both having a deep investment of that and that being a space of, for a possibility of coalition, right? And explicitly being named as such, right? The police kill Black and Indigenous people at rates unseen by any other racial group anywhere in this nation, at least, and in Canada, right? And so thinking about, we ended up talking about, I think what Nick Estes and Kim Tallbear were articulating in a Haymarket series, where Nick was saying, you know, the police emerge out of white settler militias as well as slave patrols, right? So this policing, for instance, incarceration can be mapped through the reservation and the prison, right? Black geographies of carcerality, Indigenous geographies of carcerality. So carcerality could be another term, a shared term for Black and Indigenous people, as well as the police, not police violence, but the police itself as emerging out of attempts to conquer both Black and Indigenous people. And so that's why I think your first question, like that map was so important, like not conquest as a settled project, but the attempt to conquer and contain through military forces, particularly militias that existed during the time of that map making, and the kinds of slave patrols that were policing the people who took part in the Stonewall Rebellion and rebellions afterwards, right? So just the emergence of the police here on this continent.
Great, thanks.
There's also a question from Kendall Granberry asking if you could speak a bit more to gender and queerness and how that relates to some of the theoretical underpinnings of the work.
Yeah, so I think the spaces where I explicitly took up gender and sexuality in a meaningful way, so beyond my discussion of the notion of like Spillerian flesh, or Hortense Spillers as flesh in the first chapter, I thought about the different kinds of genders, particularly the different kinds of Indigenous masculinities that were rendered in Julie Dash's work and Tia Miles's work. So thinking about explicitly naming St. Julian Lashchild's masculinity as non-normative. And I was light on the queer because, again, I was trying to use a language other than queer that was coming out of Black studies, or what Black studies is kind of reaching for. Not that Black queer studies wasn't immensely helpful, but I just didn't, there was something in excess of queer when I think you're talking about Blackness and indigeneity. And I used, it was suggested to me by one of my readers to use Greg Thomas's work on Sylvia Wynter's Beyond to think about a frame outside of queerness for naming, particularly Indigenous sexuality and Indigenous masculinity. So I'm thinking about St. Julian Lashchild's masculinity as something that's open and amenable to being in proximity and even becoming Black, right? Even living a kind of Black existence ontologically, if not like phenotypically or at the level of blood, right? And so I thought about his relationship and proximity to Blackness through his masculinity, right? And the kind of relationship that he had with Iona Pazant, I couldn't put on a normative reproductive trajectory given the ways that Black and Native people experience premature death. So even like their attempts and their production of children doesn't happen along the same kind of axis of futurity that Lee Edelman takes issue with. Like it's a whole different kind of reproduction, right? A reproduction against the logics of anti-Blackness and genocide. So that's where I'm doing some theoretical work around gender and sexuality. And then taking pleasure in Tia Miles giving space to a Black lesbian woman and a Muskogee and Cherokee lesbian woman, like just celebrating that lesbian and queer subjectivity and non-normative subjectivity. I really appreciated that. And then there is, Kendall, if you're interested in looking more closely, a critique that I do of Catherine Bond Stockton's work, Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shame, where in that book, she's making an argument that until Blackness meets up with, and Black studies and Black aesthetics meets up with queerness, it's kind of conservative and it has a normative impulse. And I'm like, that is impossible given our relationship to enslavement and becoming ungendered through the Middle Passage and that oceanic project that Spillers articulates so well, that Natasha Tinsley articulates so well. There is no need for Blackness to become queer or non-normative or errant only through a white queer studies, right? So that's another place where I explicitly engage queer theory on the terms of Black studies.
Thank you. I really appreciate the way you're reading Daughters of the Dust. It's one of my favorites, so thank you for that.
Thank you. I get to share space with Julie Dash tomorrow for a book release. Well, on Zoom, so I feel that too.
Hey, I can ask a couple more questions from the chat box. And I'm going to combine these two because I feel like they're kind of related. So the first one is from Pilar Jefferson. In the book, you talk about both speaking the language of the true violence and also of the language that we don't have yet to bring Black and Indigenous experiences together. Now that the book has been out for a bit, do you feel like you have more language for that confluence or have identified places where that work is being done? And then just to attach to that, can you please share some text in Native studies that are beginning to trouble the violence of humanism?
I almost forgot again. No, thank you, Pilar. I feel like I am always getting new ideas, particularly in engagements like these where I'm giving book talks and people are giving me feedback, or people are giving me suggestions about where I could identify existing language and where new language might be emerging. So definitely where I'm looking for existing and new language is in the literature on Afro-indigeneity, for sure. Have I found it myself yet? No, I'm still kind of on the search for it, and I'm still challenged by my assumption that Black studies did not have as robust of a language of land as it needed to be in conversation with Native studies. I'm particularly grateful for the challenge by my colleague Xerxes. So I have different modalities to think about how Black folks and Indigenous folks make themselves legible to one another. Could it be in the dance and ceremony space, in the space of the unspoken, right? Could it be in images of ceremony, a particular kind of sensorium, a sharing of smoke, of smell? Like, are there different ways to connect to not just land, but non-human relations, right? So to be more expansive than land. So I'm looking for more sites, to be honest. Pilar, I'm looking for more sites. So I can't say definitively I found that language. Contestations to humanism, definitely. Am going back to Kim Tallbear's work, Zoe Todd's work. Was just talking about Sherry Dimoline's work, who wrote The Marrow Thieves. So thinking about Indigenous speculative fiction as a place. As We Have Always Been is a text I keep going back to by Leanne Simpson, to think about the humanist tendencies within that 1844 text by Marx, the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. So those are a few that I can name off the top of my head.
So we have a little bit more time. So if there are other questions that students want to field.
Yes. I think this question is perfect to kind of bring us all, into focus. This one's from Katie. Thank you so much for your groundbreaking scholarship, Dr. King. I love the way you have brought Black and Native studies together, and I think you've really set a standard for these vital discussions. How do we as scholars continue to make space for and create further collaboration among Black and Native studies?
I'm on mute. I was like, I wonder if that's my colleague, Katie W. No, that's a good question. I like this question. I know I personally want more space and time. So I guess what that would mean for me would be not even symposium formats or conference formats where we're required to produce something, but some spaces where Black scholars and Native scholars can get together and create things that we have not seen before. So create literature, poetry, films, performances, do some deep work with each other around healing that is out of view of white folks. I think that is critical. And we might be in a position where we have to use our own limited resources and not the resources of the institutions that we are employed by to do that. But as much as people can do that in the places where they are, and given our different way of being connected to one another across time and space through Zoom, I think there are new kinds of possibilities for that I'm excited about exploring with folks. So conversations could be had like on the ready without travel right now. And then I'm really compelled by, and I'm trying to have an ethical relationship to this work. I just became aware of, and as soon as I want to say her name, her last name is Battle. She's a climate justice activist out of Louisiana, and is doing work with Black and Indigenous women who are making ceremony like up and down the Mississippi, starting in Minneapolis, and I think ending in Louisiana. Like that kind of work, I would love to be a part of and not study, just to do it. So like building relationships because we need to and we need each other and not worried about a product. Is something that is necessary to the work. I mean, it's necessary for trust building. It's necessary to get around the ways that white people try to mediate and control the way that we relate to one another in the academy. I see a lot of like blocking and redirecting and trying to control Black and Native people and dominate the conversation to make sure it's a white Native conversation or a white Black conversation. So if we can evade those attempts, to sequester us, like I think that's the work that we need to do both personally and when we have the opportunity professionally, for sure.
Thank you.
So we are just about out of time. I just wanted to invite you, Dr. King, if there's any closing remark that you wanted to make to us. This is just an exceptional, amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
No, Tina, thank you. Thank you so much. This has been really pleasurable. I've been ridiculous about booking too many Zoom events, and there's some that I'm really not, that have really tired me out, but I have so much, and I have so much affirmation for the work that I want to continue to do, particularly around Afro-indigeneity. So I thank you for people holding that space open for me and like making that an intention of mine and agreeing on that intention. So no, I appreciate all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so, so much. We have really enjoyed and learned so much from you today. And there's so many really interesting questions here in this chat. So hopefully we can share these with you. I think they're really generative. And
Colette Battle, thank you, Deborah. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks so much for your work, Dr. King.
Thank y'all so much.